Hello, Eddie.
Good afternoon, Àlex. It's so wonderful to connect with you again. And we have so much to talk about, not only on the world stage, but also in terms of our subject today. So far, our journey has been really discovering the beauties of science, but also the limitations of science, and how, if we just slightly open the cracks, we can have a glimpse, and then if we widen that crack, we can really look beyond into the great unknown that needs to be explored. So I'm really looking forward to exploring that with you. And
Yes.
I was only thinking today, in view of world events, how important that quality of kindness is. Just a small act of kindness can make such a difference to a person.
That seems to take us off from what we're going to talk about, but it's so
Of
interesting you
course.
mentioned it at the beginning because
Mm,
as a dark side to kindness, I see a lot of resentment today.
mm.
Worthy meaning justified, let's put it this way, and also perhaps unjustified. And this resentment is seems to be good friends with evil, and it's a horrible combination, and it's really difficult to heal.
Yes, it is, Alex. But just trying to relate it to our subject, that resentment is a closing in
Hmm.
of oneself. It's putting an artificial wall around one's consciousness, so to speak. So if one just realizes the flow and change and interchange between us and the rest of the world, that would heal a lot of the resentment which comes from the I, me, mine, not yours, and all of this possessiveness.
And this relates to the also to the subtitle of
Mm-hmm.
chapter five. We're going to discuss today chapter 5 and 6, right?
Yes,
In our
yes, absolutely right.
this is our
Absolutely.
third
Mm-hmm.
installment,
Mm-hmm.
and as you put it, these chapters up to chapter 6, more or less, they are preparing the ground
Mm-hmm.
for what comes in 7 and 8 and so on, which is perennial philosophy
Yes.
presented at
And
last.
5 and 6 are the transitional.
Yes. And I really appreciate the title of chapter 5, which is Training Our Eyes to See Beyond. And the subtitle is Uncomfortable Science. So
Yes.
this discomfort in this context is something good because it's what, in a way, forces us to want to see beyond and therefore be able to see beyond. So perhaps what you just mentioned at the beginning has a lot to do with what we're going to discuss today,
Mm-hmm.
related to kindness and resentment.
But also, right at the start, I think it's worth mentioning that there is no question of being anti-science or anti-scholarship. But what we are pointing out is the rigid structures imposed by the church of scientism, so to speak, with their priests and archbishops guarding the status quo. But also, some of the greatest scientists have not been academic as such, and they have not had academic qualifications or much scholarship. And the greatest of scientists are the ones who broke away from the established church, so to speak. Well, Max Planck is the obvious one. But the ones who didn't have academic qualifications as such were Mendeleev, of the periodic table, and the incredible Ramanujan, who landed up being a fellow of Trinity and a fellow of the Royal Society, deeply intuitive mathematician with no formal training as such.
Yes, it is as if the orthodox path
Mm,
shapes the person into a particular kind of tool, which is necessary, perhaps a more analytical tool, a tool that can see, cut, and observe the parts but then one needs this kind of lateral approach, wider approach. And that's really hard if you've been mauled by the system for decades. And that's why there's this strange combination of those who just seem to be, just happen to be there. And there are many examples indeed of foreigners who, and Nietzsche would be one for philosophy. It's not just for science, that they just appear there and change it all and then leave in a way. And let me just remark, it's so necessary, and at the same time I find it so tiresome that you and I and others, we always need to preface what we're going to say by the way, this is not anti-science. This is, it's necessary, but
we have to, yes, exactly.
We have to. But you see, that betrays the very thing we're trying to transcend, which is like, we're going to say things that hopefully are coherent and consistent and are faithful to the evidence that there is and so on, and hopefully intelligent and perhaps with good heart. But we need to make this disclaimer, right? Because the disclaimer is saying this may sound to some as if it's not scientific. What an irony.
Yeah, it's very scientific. Because science, from scary, is to explore, to discover. And as Socrates said, to know what you don't know.
So you contrast these breakdown, as you write, of materialism. And we could talk hours and hours about materialism. It's an endless topic. And then we find those that say, well, what do you mean by post-materialism? And then we could reply, well, what do you mean by materialism? What do you mean by matter? And two tribes here fighting. But then you contrast that with enlightened science. And in chapter 5, so that we can, land on it, you do that through theory of mind, neurosciences, of course, and also I realize theory of life, because you speak about evolution as well, right? So, and then you, in particular, with these examples of intelligence without detectable brain, and also evolution, and you ask, man from ape, really? And again, when one says that, one is to say, wait, don't change to another channel, or don't click on another video. We're still talking science. So perhaps we could unfold these two big avenues indeed, theory of mind and theory of life, and how they show a path towards a more enlightened science, as you call it.
Right, that's a huge question. The theory of mind is related, of course, to a theory of life. But a theory of mind is based on presuppositions and assumptions, of course. So if we take the sort of orthodox position that there's nothing but matter, and therefore intelligence is the product and combination of matter and its interactions, and it's building up brick upon brick. And so when the material principle, the brain, so to speak, dies, there is no consciousness left at all. But if we take an integral approach to science and embrace both the objective and the subjective aspects of man and the cosmos, if we start by postulating transcendence, that is, a divine existence, then we say that the universe is multi-dimensional. It's an organic entity. It's a living entity. And therefore, it displays innate intelligence, not intelligence as the product of something else, innate intelligence. So why limit knowledge and experience just to the physical senses? So consciousness need not be restricted to physical matter or the brain, and it may indeed survive the death of the brain, and consciousness may even be fundamental. It may even be unconditioned, and it could display, and this is important, a whole spectrum of states with matter as its effect and not its cause. So this matter argument and problem is really a question of appearances. So consciousness expresses as matter. It presents an appearance of matter. You haven't got consciousness in matter in exactly the same way as E equals mc squared. You haven't got energy in matter or matter in energy. You have one presenting as the other, but they're both one fundamental intelligent substance, if I can put it that way. So in terms of the theory of evolution, it completely cuts across a sort of orthodox mainstream approach that we are built up from matter. So we started with the elementary unicellular organisms, and then as a result of that evolutionary pressure, we were built up from that to the state where we are. And of course, the Darwinian talks of natural selection and mutation. The neo-Darwinian talks about gene frequencies, which provide a pool of genes from which natural selection chooses that which determines the survival of the fittest, so-called. So by turning the whole thing round, starting from the transcendent, we get a very different picture that emerges than if we start from the assumption, and it's no more than an assumption, that matter is the primary. What I find very amusing is in that picture I have of Darwin's brain, preserved in, I think, University of Pennsylvania, Sandra Whittleson of University of McMaster writes in the wonderful British medical journal, The Lancet. She talks about the sense of wonder she felt in awe, holding Einstein's brain. Well, I mean, I don't know if she actually held it, but okay, looking at it. But she says holding Einstein's brain. And to think that this brain I'm holding was responsible for, changing our concept of the universe. Now, let's just think about that. About 10 miles from me, there's a beautiful stately home that has Chopin's two pianos when he came to England, his Broadwood piano, his player. If I hold the piano, meaning I can't lift it, if I'm playing it, if I hold the piano, am I creating Chopin's music? Really? Just holding the piano. So am I writing his sonatas, his etudes, his ballades, his scherzi, his concerto? Just see the naivety of this, holding the organ, and that's holding everything Einstein did. And this is the fixation in mainstream science, the inability to distinguish the instrument from the performer at any level. Mm-hmm. In more esoteric terms, distinguishing spirit from matter. Spirit, the active animating principle, matter, its means of expression.
And before we again mention today, and we did it in our previous sessions, evidence, if you wish, that the points there, let's just stay where we are now and say, all we're asking, and it's a lot we're asking, it's to look things, as you were saying, from another starting point. And I've realized, and this will come later for our viewers, in I think it's in chapter 8, probably, in 7, that you can build. That's how I think of it. You can build a cosmos. You can build your cosmology, your idea of the world from the bottom up, or you can do it from the top down. And so you can say, well, there was just inert, purposeless particles and so on, and then life, and then evolution took over, and then the brain, and da-da-da. Fine. You can perform that exercise of construction like this, or you can start with kind of more like divine, if you want, principles or spiritual principles, and then let them go down. And I think, again, all we're saying is one could conceive a science that uses this second way as well as as to build the whole construction, and then we'll see what the data has to say. And so it's like there are two directions, but for some complex historical, philosophical, ideological reason, only one is allowed, and this one is insufficient. And so we need the other one as well, and probably it's superior, but that we can see later.
Yes, as you said, only one is allowed. And in the previous, I think, chapter 4, I just have a little diagram showing knowledge filtration. What is permitted is let through the filter, but what is true but not permitted is dropped into the trash can. And I've also listed the various the artifices, the devices that scientists use to knock what they find unacceptable. And I've just given the example of the incredible research done by 4 Nobel laureates on mediumship. Marie Curie, Pierre Curie, and Charles Richet. Why 4? Because Marie Curie got 2 Nobel Prizes. And none of their research for 2 years on the Italian, Stepio Palladino, has ever been acknowledged. Now, why? 4 Nobel laureates, and they wrote it. It's been written, talked about, but no, it's not allowed. So how dare science, mainstream science, claim that it is an open exploration of truth? They only look at the evidence and they modify the theory to suit the evidence. Really? No. If the evidence doesn't fit the theory, the evidence is rubbish.
So you mentioned this word in chapter 5. You talk about platforming, which is quite a contemporary use in terms of, well, all the free speech battles and so on, and cancellation. But to be positive about it, you speak about the platforming of what you call post-materialist science, of consciousness mainly, but that's because consciousness is precisely, as I said, like opens the biggest crack in this wall. So would you mention some of you mentioned the organizations and also individuals, because again, I realize what we're doing here as well. I mean, I think the bigger goal of this is to talk about perennial philosophy, but in doing that, we are platforming this other way of being a scientist. And so it's important that, because look, Edi, I didn't know that these organizations existed 2 years ago. Right? So perhaps people don't know them, and it would be worthwhile that you articulate some of them and what they're doing.
Yes, certainly. In the present world situation, of course, we find a lot of peer pressure and what we might call the politics of knowledge, where very powerful factors impeding open-minded inquiry and scientific progress get in the way. But scientists are now increasingly finding the courage to research spirituality without fear of ridicule, even though there is a lot of fear and peer pressure. But still, for example, the signs of optimism, to answer your question, are firstly the summit in Arizona in Tucson. I think in 2014, they produced a manifesto for a post-materialist science, and it contained an appeal by international scientists from all walks of science, the biology, physics, chemistry, history of science, sociology, arguing for a more open approach to science that is not threatening to the mainstream but goes beyond. But then there was a very important paper by Etzel Kardina. I think he is Swedish, but he submitted it to the journal. He submitted it to the journal Frontiers in Consciousness in Neuroscience, and it included 100 co-signatories, again from internationally acclaimed scientists. Then the other wonderful light comes, of course, from the Galileo Commission of the Scientific and Medical Network, which is really gaining a lot of traction. You have an event today and 2 more events. So scientists are now beginning to come out of the closet a bit.
Mm.
Even though, as Ian McGilchrist said, science is still practiced factory fashion like in an industry.
Mm.
And many a scientist who steps out of line has much to lose, even those who are famous and have made their name.
Yes, and that's why I joke and I say, well, we're talking at the edges of consciousness and also at the edges of academia as well, right?
Yes.
We're
definitely.
in and out.
Yeah.
Now, could you say, because there's some things to cover still for chapter 5, and also we need to move to chapter 6, but in chapter 5, there are at least 3 points I want to dive into. One is this, I'll just mention one and then the other 2. One is this spectrum, the spectrum of consciousness. You speak about the idea of consciousness, its modern usage, and then the spectrum. And again, in this kind of really nice progressive, like musical progressive fashion, where you start with the physical one, and one would say, okay, we're done if we dealt with the physical. But no, there's the lower, the higher, the group, the collective, and the cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, sure. Right. Spectrum is an important word. I'd use the analogy of water, where H2O has a spectrum, so to speak, ranging from ice, water, steam, superheated steam. So the physical consciousness, well, of course, associated with the physical brain. And I give the analogy of a radio set, which isn't tuned to any station at all. So the radio switched on, and you have the internal circuitry powered by the electricity, but it's not tuned to anything at all. And so in terms of the famous iceberg model, this is the tip of the iceberg, what we see in the objective world. And in this model, the unconscious, so-called, is the reservoir of feelings, thoughts, and memories that lie outside our conscious awareness. So we have the radio set switched on, it's not tuned. Now with the lower consciousness, we can say this radio set is tuned to a lower frequency. And still continuing with the radio, the radio's got 4 push buttons. So the lower frequency are to do with the lower mortal aspects of the personality, which we'll talk about in volume 2, but essentially the physical body, the etheric vehicle, the astral body, and the lower mind. But it's like a radio set with 4 push buttons, and it deals with the mortal personality. The radio is tuned to a lower frequency, and for a higher frequency, of course, the higher self, it pertains not to the lower self, not to the mortal personality, but it pertains to the immortal, the individuality. So then if we can continue that, there is, of course, cosmic consciousness, where after a long process of self-refinement, the individual consciousness is merged voluntarily into the universal field of consciousness in what's known as samadhi. And it marks the full flowering and culmination of the human journey of self-development. And the hallmark of such consciousness is, it is characteristically a state of extreme awareness and full awareness. It's a non-local awareness, so to speak. And it has nothing to do with delusion, hallucination, or drugs, of course.
But you're saying...
Sorry, go on.
I was going to say that as you're articulating this, even when neuroscientists talk about consciousness, they agree there's so many, like the word means so many things, there are different types of consciousness and so on. And I was imagining this is as you're laying them on on a surface and say, well, there's this access consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, this and that, attention, there are unconscious processes, and nevertheless, they can be related to decision making, but as if it wasn't a flat surface. But now as you're describing these 4 buttons, which is, you're doing it in a very straightforward manner for us to understand. But again, this is not a cheap analogy, as we'll see. And then you speak about the immortal aspect, and then this non-local awareness. Consciousness now gets kind of this higher dimensionality. I just wanted to share that feeling, right? As opposed to, well, yeah, there are all these many things we can tune in at the physical level, and that's complex enough. And that creates a lot of trouble in understanding what type of consciousness are neuroscientists usually talking about. But here we are now in 3 dimensions, talking about all of those concepts that, I insist, in your background, on your world, may be very natural, but even to me, now that I'm talking to you, I'm still surprised. It's like, yeah, I've heard about those things, but what is he really talking about? And this has been in many traditions. This is serious stuff. This is not just some talking about consciousness we cannot see because it's beyond whatever material plane. This is a well-articulated system. So I wanted to acknowledge that, like, all of a sudden there's this picture of consciousness that has some volume. It's not just like a surface with all these
well
thoughts.
said, Àlex. Yes, it's certainly not a new idea. It's just about the most perennial idea, and it's very well authenticated in the great world traditions. Yes, most certainly, in their different language, but always pointing to the one source of our being.
And so then we have consciousness. You mentioned we have mind and we have brain. So if it wasn't enough to have the mind-body problem and try to, as I say, just mutilate one part and say, no, there's really only brain. But we don't have 2 elements here. We have kind of a trinity, or at least we have 3. Can you then say the role of consciousness and how that's different from mind? And that you say that mind is the interface between consciousness.
Well, you can see mind, yes, mind is the interface. Mind, you can say, is a grouping or a coming together of certain aspects of consciousness. Or you can say, in a more scientific sense, as beautifully stated by Stuart Hameroff, Penrose's great collaborator, mind is the tuner. Again, he uses the radio analogy, mind or television. Mind is the tuner that accesses the ripples of space and time. So a mind is that tuning thing, and the brain, so to speak, is the physical circuitry of the radio. Which is why I end chapter 5 with that diagram of 3 slabs, which I got from Newton's tremendous work, of course, when he was describing the difference between spirit, soul, and body, or in his terms, showing the unity and the difference in the Trinity.
Just to gloss what you're doing here again, as I did by describing this volume, here you're doing another very interesting thing, apparently very simple, but I think it's very deep and powerful, that rather than going from 2 to 1, we go from 2 to 3, and there we find the solution, or a glimpse of a proper understanding of the mind-body problem, which is now consciousness, mind, and brain problem, going to 3 rather than trying to go to 1.
One always finds the 3 appearing in all great systems. I mean, the laws of mechanics, the Newton's 3 laws, the laws of light, the laws of electromagnetism, you always find this triplicity. Why this triplicity? Because we have the impulse, the top, the positive pole, the negative pole, and the current that flows between them, so to speak.
Yes. Now, speaking about these 3, this triad, I make this high-level point again because I think it's important, and the readers can go to the details. It's impossible to cover them in our conversations. I make the general point that not only are you offering here a conceptual material to understand this from the theoretical point of view, philosophical, but speaking about the tuning, the brain and the mind, and the mind is the interference and the tuning, you talk about attunement and refinement, which immediately brings us to the work, kind of the yoga that each person, that each human, that each man, in the sense we described it, the first installment, right? So their perennial philosophy, again, shows itself as something more than a philosophical system, because it has to do with the attunement, refinement of our instruments. And that leads us to the following chapter, actually, chapter number 6, when you speak about this gateway. So I wanted to emphasize that as well. It's not just, all right, now we think of the brain or of the mind as this, with this other metaphor. No, this other metaphor invites us to attune ourselves.
That's a very, very important point, Àlex. I'm so glad you made that point. It is supremely practical. And you understand why I think Wordsworth, or was it Blake? Anyway, talked about cleansing the doors of perception. When the more you cleanse the doors of perception, which is attunement, the more refined will be your vision, and the cleaner the door or the window, the more accurately and faithfully will the light enter.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupt you. I smile because the way, and I've studied those theories, the way orthodox theories of cognition and consciousness, and it's not the same anyways, and even behavior, the 3 C's, as I call them, comportment, cognition, and consciousness. In any case, most of those theories start from, and we spoke about starting points, from a point of view where the brain is shut from the external world. It's like in this kind of Platonic caves. And so there we don't have windows, actually, it's walled. It's a big wall, and all we can do is kind of guess based on what we're generating inside. So it's a very different model of our relationship to what we call the world. Because if we speak about windows and we speak about cleansing them, hopefully the light that can come in conveys us the reality of the world. But if it's walled, all we can do is guess. And this also has very practical implications as to how one lives one's life.
Oh, very much so. That refinement and attuning, very simply, in the physical world, obviously, is your physical habits and your diet and all the rest of it. But far more importantly, what creates the walls and all the junk are mental concepts, outward mental concepts. And the whole essence of meditation is to be aware of those concepts and see them merely as concepts and not let them intrude.
I had another image here, which was that we're desperately trying to cleanse those windows with a cloth, which is dirty. Which is dirty. Yes. And like many times philosophers, theoreticians, and even empirical scientists who think they don't have a cloth to wedge, but we're there just working hard, and it becomes darker and darker because the cloth is dirty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good one.
Well, one other concept, more than a concept, an important topic you mentioned here in chapter 5, and then we'll move to chapter 6, is the nature of memory.
Yes. Memory is this very collective term we use. It's a very generic term. So memory is, of course, physical and it's brain dependent. But memory has handmaidens, and the handmaidens are recollection and remembrance. But then there's reminiscence. So the memory is... Let me give you an example. I think that's best done through an example. If I hear a beautiful piece of music, say a song by Schubert, tomorrow I'll know the composer, I know the work, I know who played it, who sang it. So that I'm retrieving physical memory there. After about 3 months, I may not know who was the singer or when I heard it, but I can recollect the tune. I can recollect the feelings that it evoked in me. So that is a recollection and a remembrance. But reminiscence is something completely different. A reminiscent is a memory of the soul, for example. So I may reminisce in my old age about a tune I heard in my youth, and it evokes feelings that I might have had in a former life or in a former stage in my current life. So reminiscing is a soul memory. It's not a brain memory. And what better example of reminiscent than William Wordsworth's intimations of immortality? Our life is but a dream, and we're going to wake up to another dream. So these great poets and artists really pointed the way in their beautiful language and through poetry.
I get to try again. I try it here, right? We find it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then there is the Akashic record, of course, the universal memory, which is the enduring record of all that happens, will happen, and always will in the whole universe. And Erwin Laszlo has written a wonderful book on the Akasha, which is not a figment of New Age imagination. Far from it. It's one of the deepest tenets of the perennial philosophy.
Indeed.
So in terms of memory, we have the Platonic idea of recollection, that we are born possessing all knowledge, so to speak, and our task is to discover it. So paradoxically, there's an old saying, you can only learn what you already knew.
Mm-hmm.
You're relearning. And the great geniuses have shown, obviously, how quickly they discovered what they already knew.
Let me offer here an insight I got from one of my, if not my favorite philosopher, which is Henri Bergson, the French philosopher. Sure. He's the philosopher of time, despite having been put to the margins because of some historical clashes. And he's the philosopher of memory as well, and also of evolution and creativity, many things. But I understood something from Bergson that I think it's important here. In the same way we were talking at the beginning of this conversation about the difference between building your story from the bottom up or from the top down. When Bergson speaks about memory, but also when he speaks about perception, and also when he speaks about what the brain is doing with respect to focusing our attention on practical matters of life. And well, his underlying point is that we go from more to less. So it's not that we are trying to build up a perception or that we remember something but just kind of saving it and then it can get lost. It's like this is all there, and what we do is go always from more to less, not from less to more. And that's maybe explain like that. If you haven't read Bergson, it's hard to grasp, but it's a very profound idea, and it resonates with what you're saying. Everything is already there. Another way to say it is that memories, in a more Whiteheadian sense, nothing lasts, would say Whitehead from this perceptual point of view. But Bergson would come and say, yes, but nothing is lost. And so then all these memories, and this is really hard to understand to the mind of a physicist and to the mind of a neuroscientist, and I have both minds and I work with them, which is, but where are memories? I mean, you're saying they're not in the brain, they're in the soul. What's the soul? What happens if you forget? But this is, again, we're not starting from less to more. We're saying everything is there, and it's more a matter of retrieval, recollection, reminiscence. It's like how you bring them back, but they are there. Where? Well, they're not in space, they're in time. And so, I just wanted to, this was a long footnote to say that it helped me a lot to think things through by realizing that one can think, let me just say this, perhaps it will be more clear. Bergson discusses this problem of, where did everything come from? You know, the usual paradox of the theoretical physicist about the origin of the universe. Like, how come everything come from nothing? And then Bergson says, no. First, you have everything. and then you pretend it is not there, and then you play with your mind to try to figure out how things could have appeared. So really, you started with everything, then you went to less, and now you find yourself surprised. You cannot explain how in that limit when less is nothing, how you can go back to everything. But if you do it, if you change the starting point, you can breathe, and everything makes much more sense.
And everything is not just a building up of brick upon brick, fact upon fact, making a huge tower block. It's not everything in that sense. It's the fullness of the void, so to speak. It's that plenum which contains the potential for and the seed of everything. Yeah.
And one more thing, and then this is all consistent with the idea that the brain is a filter, or it does filtering, because what it's doing, it's precisely that. It's taking everything, and because we don't need everything to do what we do in our daily life, we just say, no, only this particular thing. But when you have an accident or when you're about to die, it's quite likely that then this opens, and that's where you have this influx of the whole coming, and then you don't need to explain it. Your explanatory task is not how you went from this quasi the same firings or even less to produce this whole panoply of experience. It's more like, well, that was there, and now you're not filtering it, so you're not constraining what's coming in.
Yes. Heisenberg's dying words to his pupil, von Weizsäcker. What did he say? It is very easy. I never knew this. Physics is of no importance. Fancy Heisenberg saying that, Nobel laureate. Physics is of no importance. I now know that the world is illusion. But of course, you have to understand what he means by illusion. He's not saying it's an illusion. He's not saying physics is unimportant, far from it. But what he's saying is that the reality that physicists apply to the physical world is the illusion. That's the illusion. The reality is what created that illusion.
This is perhaps a good moment to talk about some of the elements of chapter 5. Sorry, 6, you're right, 6, you're right. Which you entitled A New Continent of Thought. I love that phrase. And well, there you talk about this what you call gateway, a gateway through materialism. We've been discussing it a little bit, but let's make it more explicit. What are those gateways, and why a new continent? It's like here we are at the edges of something unknown.
So what you're asking is, what is the gateway? Oh, well, the gateway is now the opening of the cracks that we were talking about earlier. And also a lot of that opening has been done, to its great credit, by neuroscience that has shown that the brain is plastic and not a rigid static organ, as was once thought. So that is one great contribution of science. It's to create an awareness that the map is not the same as the territory, and there is an unknown life that exists behind the ordinary mundane existence, as it does behind all manifestation, and that there is a science of evolution not just restricted to the physical.
Why is the discovery, let me ask you here, why is the discovery of neuroplasticity, the fact that the brains are plastic, that they can change themselves? So well, it's important indeed, but why is it a gateway through materialism? Because materialist scientists will say, well, we've actually found it and we are perfectly happy with it. It doesn't challenge us at all.
In the sense that the old idea that memory is located in a certain specific part of the brain does not stand up, because if you remove that bit of the brain, either through accident or surgery, then the rest of the brain can compensate. So there is a holistic approach that undermines this rigid local idea of memory.
I see.
For example, the experiments performed by Carl Lashley on monkeys removing certain parts of the brain, he concluded that the brain was therefore a plastic. Then this incredible scientist with a very unusual name, was it Paul Bacchi-Rita? Am I pronouncing it properly?
Bacchi-Rita? No,
Paul, Bachy-Rita.
Okay.
Anyway, he invented a device, and this will be very close to your heart, Àlex. He invented this device that allowed blind people to read, to perceive shadows and distinguish between close and distant objects. So what he said is, we see with our brains, not with our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this would certainly relate to extra-auricular vision.
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then another gateway provided by Jules Bolt-Taylor, the great the neuroscientist who suffered a massive stroke. And her book, after she recovered, was called My Stroke of Insight. And during the stroke, she alternated between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and she realized that she was really experiencing completely different realities. So what we take as objective reality is in fact highly influenced by the instrumentality of perception, by the cleanse or the lack of cleanliness of the perception.
Mm-hmm. There was an article from last year by a very prominent neuroscientist entitled "We don't know how the brain stores anything, let alone words." And I've been in contact with him, and I asked him, well, could we change the title and ask, we don't know not just how, but whether the brain stores anything, let alone words.
Because how presupposes it does in the first place.
Yes, and that article is just to be honest about the huge difficulty in trying to find it in synapses. And of course, they all play a role, but not really in synapses, not really. Some people say, well, it's going to be in the nucleus of the cells, not there. Well, it's going to be in the network. Well, then it seems to be this phenomenon called representational drift. And then the thing moves from one part of the brain to another, and they don't really know how. Well, it's going to be the whole brain. Some orthodox, now perhaps a bit more heterodox neuroscientists now claim it must be on DNA. So you see all these desperate,
very desperate.
They're fine, but all these desperate hypotheses to try to locate it somehow, which means that they implicitly agree they haven't found it, but it must be there. So we must continue looking for. Just changing the word how by the word whether. It's wild, but can make makes a huge difference. Yeah.
They're looking for a needle in a haystack when the needle isn't there in the first place.
Yes. One always has the excuse, I need 10 more minutes until I'll find it, please.
Or 10 million more.
Yes, 10 million more. And 10 more
million is nothing now.
And a decade, which is something that's now easy. Yeah, give me another decade. Okay, now there's another triad appearing here. In chapter 6, when you speak about the analytical versus the holistic approach and the many on the one, which is science. I mean, this is going to sound very obvious, but I want to emphasize it's science, right? Then this is green light of the traffic light. Then there is philosophy. I'm joking here, but it's more like the orange line. Well, philosophy, because many scientists say, well, philosophers, we don't want to have them around too much because we are not doing that. Despite I always, and you will agree that I always claim that somebody who says, the scientist that says he or she has no metaphysics is he or she has the most dangerous kind of metaphysics by saying, oh, I don't have any. Yeah. So science, philosophy, and then you mentioned religion, right? Which that will be the traffic light. The traffic light will get red. Like, no, religion, no way. We had done without religion at last. But you bring them back together here for this holistic approach. Why?
Because otherwise, you've got a two-legged stool, so to speak. You need balance with three legs. You need Religion really has a bad press now, and people talk rubbish about it. And I've gone into this and shown the unity of religions in a very big way in Volume 2, in Chapter 7. But just for now, we need philosophy to provide the grand plan. We need science to give us a methodology of how we're going to scale this mountain. And we need religion to point out a particular path.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at it differently, science enables us to live efficiently, philosophy to live ethically, and religion to live morally. So in terms of an incredibly simplistic analogy, if I'm driving my car and I'm completely drunk, that's incredibly immoral, because obviously I might kill people. If I'm drunk, the emphasis is my immoral state. If I'm perfectly normal and sober, but my exhaust is emitting ghastly fumes, polluting the atmosphere, that's unethical. But if I'm driving along in first gear at 50 miles an hour along a motorway, that's highly inefficient.
Mm-hmm.
So we need these three. And as David Lorimer so perfectly once put it, that our sense of morality, our sense of what is right and wrong, our sense of justice is the ethical capital from religion. However much religion may have, they don't cause wars. I mean, it's in the name of religion, but however much religion may have, gone on rocky ground, it still provides that moral and ethical basis. Now, there is nothing in science that talks of morality. There's no instruction in Newton's three laws, in the laws of light or magnetism, or the laws of acoustics, that talks about how we should behave. Of course, we have highly ethical scientists, we have highly unethical scientists. But science on its own will not provide an ethical and moral basis for life.
Yes, and that's another way of seeing this triad in a complementary way, because one can celebrate that science often tell us how things work.
Yeah.
Not so much what things are, what one would want. Then perhaps with the aid of philosophy, one can complement what science shows, in order to be able to say what things are, but then what things must be or what to do.
Right.
The is from an ought is not possible. So one needs another, what is it? another realm, another factor that can guide us there. But it's been already more than a century since it was announced that we had killed God. And it wasn't a celebration. It was more a warning. We still haven't realized the implications of that, I suppose.
We've killed our concept of God.
Yes.
Not the real God. And just let's bear in mind, religion just means religare, to bind back. So it's a way of uniting the personal self with the universal self.
Yeah.
Now, in order to do that, you need ligature, umbilical cord. So you can use a ligature or a rope to do two things. You can either hang yourself with it, or you can use it as a lifeline.
Yeah, yeah. And we're brave enough to say religion and not say spirituality, which more people will be able.
Religion,
religion.
The spirituality is a safe term. Like people use the word esoteric when they should be saying occult, but we'll come to that.
Yes, we'll come to that soon. All right. The last points, we're approaching an hour. It's fine. Yes. Well, the last point of chapter 6. I mean, I make sure we kind of at least name some of the parts of each chapter so that the readers can go and find more there. There are two more things on my side here. One is you come back here with more detail to the functional dependence.
Yes.
Again, a triad, productive, releasing, and transmissive. All right. What's the difference? How to tell? Why does it matter?
That is so important. That's the genius of William James.
Mm-hmm.
Productive function. He said the old psychological, the dogma in psychology, even in his day, was thought as a function of the brain. But what kind of function? Productive function, like steam is produced by a kettle, electric bulb is produced by electricity, but there is permissive, which is letting go. So Aldous Huxley used the analogy of a reducing valve. It can either open and let more flow of the fluid, or whatever it is, or it can reduce the flow by coming in. So permissive. And characteristically, high creativity is to do with a very low brain threshold, because when the brain threshold, the thalamus and the hippocampus and all, is at a high state of activity, that reducing valve is climbing in. So that's the state of boredom and non-creativity. When we relax, that reducing valve opens. But the most important, the most beautiful one is transmissive, where the brain is a filter. And like every great scientist or psychologist, whatever, he turns to art, whether it be music or poetry. And he quotes Shelley, that life, like a dome of many stained glass, many colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. So our brains are light colored glass, and glass has a refractive index. Mm-hmm. And depending on the refractive index, there is bending of light, more or less. So our brains and personalities bend the white radiance of eternity. But then if that glass is fractured in some places, or the glass is transparent, the pure white light, the pure radiance of eternity, gains an entrance, and we are given evidence and proof of the source.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking about the brain like that really makes it a transcendent object, right?
And I've got a diagram showing a glass brain and a prism.
Yes, yes. And again, because in principle we could entertain different metaphors, and 99% of the time it is a freaking computer, if I may say. Well, please, can we talk about other metaphors like the prism or the radio or Cajal as a forest? Ramon y Cajal would like to think of the brain as a forest, which is not a technological image. So again, so fruitful to entertain other views of what a brain, like the question, what is a brain? What a simple question. What is a brain? Well, if we want to think in terms of allegories or metaphors, we have a wider range than we usually suppose we have.
And of course, John Lorber of Sheffield University has identified many students with no detectable brain, even mathematics students.
Yes, or all the cases of hydrocephalia, right, where the brain is mostly filled with water.
With water.
How come can they live normal lives? Yes, all these really strange cases, these anomalies. What do we do with them? Now, finally, you make a final note in chapter 6, and I loved it because it's, well, at the end of the day, nobody knows. Like we're talking about the relationship between brain, mind, and consciousness. Well, that we know many things, and all these traditions and all these experiments, but nobody really knows how it works. So let's try to figure out.
What are we trying to know with? What instruments are we using for our knowing? Yes, it is ineffable, it's beyond words. But what we can do is ever closer and smaller circles round the unknowable. So the unknowable, but we can circle around it ever closer.
Intimations. Yeah.
Yes. But what are we trying to know with, and how are we trying to know? Yeah. I would really say, Àlex, there is an inner knowing, which is completely beyond words. And the great poets have put it in words in their unique way.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
That's the
there's
blind
not,
spot. It's
there
the
isn't
blind
a
spot.
knowing with. There isn't a knowing with.
Mm.
There is a knowing.
Mm.
So if I say I love you, whoever, I'm not
Mm.
loving you with.
Yeah.
I love.
Yes. That width makes a big difference in terms of conceiving what you're saying here. Hmm.
And the other wonderful, of course, I alluded to it a little earlier, is the artist and the instrument, and Paganini and the Stradivarius. That, if you give Paganini a cheap and cracked fiddle, even the great Paganini can't produce a beautiful melody because the instrument has to be perfect. So therefore, Àlex, I applaud all this research on the brain and the body, because what it's doing, it's providing more understanding on the physical vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
I applaud that. But I don't applaud the way they mix the vehicle, the physical vehicle, with the artist.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Paganini needs a Stradivarius, but the two are not the same.
And I applaud you for pointing it out in 4 volumes with such care and clarity. So can you say briefly, well, where are we now? What's next, right? We're chapter 6.
Sure.
You've prepared the ground. What's going to happen next?
Right, to a gateway through materialism. Now we're going to see the other territory. That is the whole realm of esoteric science and occult science, and the mystery teachings about universe, life, and man. And also pointing out the tremendous insight and the beauty of those teachings, but also the huge dangers when in unprepared hands, like
yes,
in any science. So there's a lovely saying that wisdom, or this kind of higher wisdom, is like a flower from which the bee makes its honey and the spider its poison, each according to their nature. So it's one flower, but you can abuse it, or you can treat it with reverence, love, and respect.
Okay, so I'm really, really looking forward to chapter 7 and 8 and the rest of volume 1, because there is where this is to motivate the listeners and the readers. There's where you start to articulate things that I've never seen articulated like that, and it's all very, well, a little bit mysterious, and at the same time it makes sense. So it's familiar. It's both familiar and strange at the same time.
Right.
So I think we're going to enjoy it very much. Thank you, Edi.
Thank you very much, Àlex. And as always, it's a great privilege to be invited by you, and I never take these things for granted. Thank you, Àlex.
Thank you.